The jungles of Vietnam hold secrets that go far beyond the stories we know from history books. When we think of that conflict that marked an entire generation between the 60s and 70s, our minds quickly conjure up images of helicopters cutting through the tropical sky, explosions echoing through the trees, and soldiers advancing through impossible terrain. But there is a dimension to this war that rarely gets the attention it deserves, a dimension that does not involve military strategies or political decisions, but rather the ruthless brute force of wild nature. This is a documentary about the true inhabitants of those forests, the creatures that dominated every inch of that territory long before any human being arrived with their weapons and uniforms. Vietnam is a country of extraordinary beauty, where mountains covered with dense vegetation rise like green giants, where rivers meander through deep valleys, and where biodiversity explodes in every corner of the landscape. But during those years of conflict, those same characteristics that made Vietnam a natural paradise turned into extreme challenges for thousands of young soldiers arriving from distant lands, completely unprepared for what awaited them. We are not just talking about the human enemy who knew every trail, every hiding place, every secret of that land. We are talking about venomous snakes hanging from branches a few inches from the ground, spiders whose bites caused unbearable pain, insects that transmitted devastating diseases, and mammals that, when cornered, they became fierce opponents. Before we continue this journey through the hidden dangers of the Vietnamese jungle, I would like to ask you to subscribe to the channel and leave in the comments the time you are watching this documentary. Your participation is key so that we can continue to bring fascinating stories like this. The war in Vietnam was fought in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. While military strategists planned operations in air-conditioned rooms, soldiers on the ground faced a completely different reality. The average temperature in the Vietnamese jungle often exceeded 35 degrees Celsius, with relative air humidity reaching 90% or more. His clothes never dried completely. His skin developed persistent fungal infections, and the simple act of breathing seemed to require a Herculean effort. But heat and humidity were just the beginning of the problems. The real threat came from those who called that place home millions of years ago. Let us begin our exploration of the most feared creatures of all, those that caused genuine apprehension even in the most experienced and courageous soldiers. The snakes of Vietnam represented a constant and invisible danger. The country is home to more than 200 species of snakes, and about 30 of them have venom potentially dangerous to humans. The bamboo viper, known scientifically as Trimeresurus albolabris, was particularly problematic. This bright green-colored snake blended seamlessly between the foliage, remaining completely still as it awaited its prey. Its length rarely exceeded 80 centimeters, which made it even more difficult to detect. Soldiers often found her hanging from branches at face level, and the first sign of his presence was often the sharp pain of his bite. The venom of the bamboo viper is hemotoxic, which means it destroys tissues and blood cells. After a bite, the affected area began to swell dramatically. The skin acquired purple and black hues, and the pain intensified every minute. Without proper treatment, tissue necrosis was inevitable, and in severe cases, amputation became necessary to save the victim's life. The problem was that in wartime conditions, especially during deep jungle patrols, access to antivenom and proper medical treatment could take hours or even days. Many soldiers carried the trauma not just from the bites themselves, but from the harrowing wait for help, watching their bodies react to the poison as their comrades desperately tried to transport them to an evacuation point. But the bamboo viper was only one among many. The kite snake, especially the species Bungarus multicinctus, posed an even greater danger. This nocturnal snake possesses an extraordinarily potent neurotoxic venom, far more lethal than that of many other species. The kite has a peculiar behavior that made it especially dangerous for soldiers who slept outdoors or in makeshift shelters. During the night, these snakes were attracted by the heat of human bodies and often curled up next to the sleeping soldiers, seeking that warmth on cooler jungle nights. Upon waking and moving, the soldier frightened the snake, which reacted defensively with a quick bite. The venom of kite gradually paralyzes the nervous system, beginning with difficulty swallowing and speaking, progressing to severe respiratory symptoms that required urgent medical intervention to save lives. The reticulated python, though not poisonous, presented its own dangers. These gigantic snakes could reach over 6 meters in length and weigh over 70 kilograms. They were patient ambushes, able to remain motionless for days waiting for the perfect prey. There have been documented reports of pythons attacking lone soldiers, especially those who ventured alone for personal needs or on reconnaissance missions. A python of this size possesses extraordinary constricting force, and its method of hunting is through compression. Finding a companion in distress with a python was a terrifying experience, and rescues required multiple men working coordinately, often resulting in injuries to rescuers. The Vietnamese jungles also housed the royal snake, the largest venomous snake in the world, capable of growing up to 5.5 meters in length. Although their venom was not the most potent among snakes, the amount injected into a single bite was extraordinarily large, enough to be extremely dangerous. The royal snake is known for its aggressive behavior when it feels threatened, lifting a third of its body off the ground and expanding its characteristic hood while emitting a deep hiss that looks more like the growl of a much larger animal. Soldiers who encountered real snakes often mistook them for fallen logs or exposed roots until it was too late. The reaction time between perceiving the threat and suffering the bite could be less than a second. But serpents were only one category of dangers that crawled through the jungle. Vietnam's arachnids had their own gallery of horrors. The Vietnamese funnel web spider, from the family Hexathelidae, built burrows in the forest floor covered by dense webs. These spiders were extremely aggressive when disturbed, and their venom contained powerful neurotoxic toxins. Soldiers who inadvertently stepped near these burrows or placed their hands on the ground during tactical movements could be stung multiple times in a matter of seconds. The fangs of these spiders were long enough to penetrate the skin easily, and the sting caused severe pain, excessive sweating, muscle spasms, and, in severe cases, difficulty breathing. Southeast Asian giant tarantulas, some with leg wingspans exceeding 20 centimeters, were commonly found in dense jungle areas. Although its venom was rarely fatal to adult humans, its bites were extremely painful and often resulted in severe allergic reactions. But the real problem with these tarantulas was psychological. Imagine being in a dark trench or shelter, away from home, in a constant state of alert, and feeling something big and hairy walking on your arm or neck. The resulting panic could make a soldier scream or move abruptly, potentially denouncing the position of his entire unit to the enemy. There have been documented cases of soldiers reflexively shooting tarantulas in their bodies, revealing their positions and initiating shootings that could have been avoided. Vietnamese scorpions, particularly species of the genus Heterometris and Lycas, were found under almost any object that offered shelter on the forest floor. Stones, fallen logs, abandoned equipment, everyone could shelter scorpions waiting for the heat of the day to pass. Soldiers who needed to look for supplies in bombed areas or scoured abandoned bunkers often encountered scorpions painfully. The stings of these arachnids caused intense and immediate pain that could last for hours, accompanied by swelling, numbness, and, in cases of multiple stings or allergic reactions, heart and respiratory problems. The venom of certain species contained neurotoxins that affected the nervous system, causing tremors, excessive sweating, and even seizures. But it wasn't just the poisonous creatures that posed threats. Vietnamese jungle mammals, while generally avoiding human contact, could become extremely dangerous when cornered, injured, or protecting their young. The Asian black bear, also known as the moon bear due to the crescent-shaped white mark on its chest, inhabited the mountain forests of Vietnam. These bears could weigh up to 200 pounds and had long, curved claws designed for climbing trees and digging. When soldiers set up camps in bear territories or inadvertently positioned themselves between a female and her cubs, the result could be dangerous. Asian black bear attacks were rare, but when they occurred, they were serious. These animals possessed considerable strength and could cause serious injury with their powerful claws and jaws. The crested porcupine, a large rodent from Southeast Asia that could weigh up to 30 kilograms, defended itself uniquely and effectively. His body was covered with sharp spines that could reach 40 centimeters in length. When threatened, the porcupine ran backwards towards the aggressor, nailing its thorns at the victim. These spines had microscopic splinters that made them move deeper into the tissues with each muscle movement of the victim, making removal extremely painful and complicated. Soldiers who accidentally cornered porcupines in tunnels or caves often emerged with dozens of spikes spiked into their legs and feet, each representing a point of possible infection in an environment where proper hygiene was virtually impossible. The wild boars of Vietnam, especially the adult males with their curved and sharp tusks, were formidable animals. They could weigh more than 100 pounds, and when provoked or injured, they attacked with astonishing speed and ferocity. Their prey posed real danger, causing significant injuries. Soldiers who encountered wild boars often underestimated them, assuming the animals would flee. But injured boars or females protecting their young attacked without hesitation, and their low, compact body structure made them difficult targets to hit with firearms in the heat of the moment. There have been multiple cases of soldiers being injured by wild boars, requiring extensive medical treatment. Vietnamese jungle primates, while generally shy of humans, could also cause problems. The tongue monkeys, with their distinctive black faces and silvery coat, lived in large family groups in the treetops. When soldiers approached their territories, especially during the breeding season, the dominant males defended their groups by throwing branches, hard seeds, and even their own excrement at the intruders. While this may seem comical in hindsight, in the context of war, any sudden movement in the trees above could be interpreted as enemy activity, resulting in shots fired that revealed positions or wasted precious ammunition. In addition, monkeys could transmit diseases, including rabies, through bites or scratches, and approaching them or trying to feed them was extremely risky. The gibbons, with their long arms and so-called distinctive vocals that echoed through the forest at dawn and dusk, inadvertently served as a natural alarm system. When humans moved through the forest, the gibbons reacted with loud, prolonged vocalizations that could be heard from miles away. This meant that any element of surprise in a military operation could be compromised by the simple act of disturbing a group of gibbons. Experienced commanders learned to plan movements taking into account the territories of these primates. But this was not always possible. Now we need to talk about the dangers that traveled in the air, the insects that turned every moment outdoors into a battle for sanity and health. The mosquitoes of Vietnam were not only annoying, they were vectors of serious diseases. Malaria was endemic throughout the country, and the Anopheles mosquito species that transmitted the parasite were present in impressive densities in the jungle. The disease caused severe fevers, violent chills, sweating, debilitating headaches, and, in untreated cases, could progress to severe forms affecting the brain. Thousands of soldiers were evacuated due to malaria, and many more continued fighting while suffering from the disease, their combat capabilities severely compromised. Dengue, transmitted by Aedes mosquitoes, caused high fevers, severe joint and muscle pain so severe that the disease was sometimes called bone-breaking fever, and rashes. Japanese encephalitis, another mosquito-borne disease, could cause brain inflammation, seizures, and leave survivors with permanent neurological sequelae. Soldiers used insect repellents whenever possible, but constant sweat and frequent immersions in rivers and swamps made any protection temporary at best. Mosquito nets offered some protection during sleep, but in active combat operations, soldiers were completely exposed. The land leeches of Vietnam represented a different kind of torment. These tiny creatures, which could be only a few millimeters long when not fed, infested vegetation in moist forest areas. They detected mammalian exhaled carbon dioxide and footstep vibrations, then moved toward potential hosts with surprising speed for legless creatures. Land leeches could squeeze through the tightest wefts of fabric, penetrating uniforms, boots, and even underwear. Once in contact with the skin, they used their saw-shaped jaws to make an incision and secreted anticoagulants and anesthetics into their saliva, allowing them to feed undetected. Soldiers often only discovered that they were covered in leeches when they stopped to rest and noticed blood trickling from multiple points on their bodies. A single leech could consume several times its own weight in blood, swelling to the size of a finger. Proper removal of leeches was important because pulling them hard could leave their jaws stuck in the skin, causing infections. The recommended method was to use salt, heat, or insect repellent to make the leech loosen voluntarily. But on the battlefield, soldiers would often tear them off, resulting in infected wounds that bled continuously due to the anticoagulants. In some cases, leeches were able to penetrate even more sensitive areas of the body during sleep, making the experience even more disturbing. Ants from Vietnam came in equally problematic varieties. Weaver ants, known locally as red ants, built elaborate nests in the treetops using leaves joined together by silk produced by their larvae. Entire colonies could hold 500,000 individuals and were extremely aggressive in defending their territories. When soldiers grazed trees containing weaver ant nests or when gunshots and explosions disturbed the colonies, thousands of ants descended en masse on anything moving below. Their bites were painful, and they injected formic acid into the wounds, intensifying the burning sensation. A soldier covered by hundreds or thousands of these ants was effectively incapacitated, the pain and panic making it impossible to maintain tactical discipline. Bullet ants, so called because their stings were compared to the pain of being shot, inhabited the forest floor and were particularly active during the rainy season. These large ants, more than 2 inches long, had stingers that injected a powerful neurotoxic venom. The pain of a single sting could last up to 24 hours, with waves of pulsating pain radiating from the affected limb. Soldiers who inadvertently disturbed colonies of bullet ants or stepped on their foraging trails were attacked by dozens of defensive workers, resulting in multiple stings that left victims in agony for days. The Vietnamese giant centipedes were nightmare creatures made reality. Some specimens could reach more than 25 centimeters in length, with segmented bodies carrying dozens of legs and a pair of modified venomous claws called forcipules. These creatures were voracious predators that hunted insects, other centipedes, and even small vertebrates like lizards and rodents. Over the night, they often raided human shelters in search of prey, and soldiers regularly woke up discovering these creatures crawling on them. Giant centipede bites caused severe pain, extensive swelling, nausea, dizziness, and in cases of allergic reactions, could lead to more serious complications. The venom contained a mixture of toxins including serotonin, histamine, and enzymes that caused local tissue necrosis. The wasps and bees of Vietnam posed particular dangers to those who disturbed their nests. The mandarin wasp, the largest species of wasp in the world, built nests in hollow trees or underground. These giant wasps, more than 5 centimeters long, had stingers of more than 6 millimeters that could penetrate light clothing. Its venom was highly toxic, causing extreme pain, and in allergic people or after multiple bites, it could cause severe reactions including anaphylactic shock. Entire colonies of mandarin wasps attacked coordinately when their nest was threatened, and there were cases of soldiers being bitten dozens of times, resulting in prolonged hospitalizations. Wasps could pursue perceived threats for hundreds of meters, making escape difficult especially in dense jungle terrain. The Asian jacket wasp, smaller than the mandarin but no less dangerous in numbers, built nests that could hold thousands of individuals. Artillery explosions or mortars often destroyed these nests, infuriating the entire colonies that then indiscriminately attacked everything moving in the area. Entire military operations sometimes needed to be aborted or postponed because important tactical areas became unviable due to swarms of aggressive wasps. Soldiers developed long-lasting phobias of buzzing sounds, and some reported panic reactions years after the war when hearing flying insects. The ticks and mites of the Vietnamese jungle were silent vectors of multiple diseases. Mite-borne typhus caused high fevers, distinctive rashes, and, without treatment, had a significant mortality rate. Spotted fever was also common, caused by bacteria transmitted by ticks. These parasites were so small that they often went unnoticed until they were firmly attached to the skin, their mouthparts buried deep as they fed on blood. Improper removal of ticks could leave the mouthparts on the skin, leading to local infections or abscess formation. In addition, ticks could transmit multiple diseases in a single bite, and soldiers often did not develop symptoms until weeks later when they were already far from the front and the diagnosis became complicated. Sandflies, tiny insects barely visible to the naked eye, transmitted leishmaniasis, a parasitic disease that caused devastating skin ulcers or, in visceral forms, compromised internal organs. Wounds caused by cutaneous leishmaniasis began as small papules but progressed to open ulcers that did not heal without specific treatment, sometimes leaving permanent disfiguring scars. The disease had a long incubation period, so soldiers often developed symptoms months after being bitten, when they had already returned home, complicating the diagnosis. Now let's talk about the dangers that inhabited the aquatic environments that permeated the Vietnamese landscape. The flooded rivers, Streams, swamps, and rice paddies were both vital resources and highly dangerous environments. Saltwater crocodiles, the largest living predatory reptiles, inhabited estuaries, mangroves, and even ventured upstream in search of prey. Adult males could exceed 6 meters in length and weigh more than 1,000 pounds, possessing the most powerful bite force of any living animal. These predators were masters of camouflage and ambush, able to remain submerged for prolonged periods with only their eyes and nostrils visible above the water, perfectly still, waiting for the ideal moment to attack. Soldiers who needed to cross rivers or operate in coastal areas were at constant risk. Crocodiles attacked with explosive speed, launching themselves from the water with their powerful jaws. Once a crocodile grabbed a victim, it used its natural spin behavior to immobilize prey. Rescuing someone from a crocodile was extremely difficult, and even direct firing often failed to penetrate the osteoderms, the bony plates beneath the skin that functioned as natural armor. The water snakes of Vietnam, particularly the species of the genus Anhydrus, were abundant in water bodies of all kinds. Although many species were harmless, some had venom capable of causing serious blood clotting problems. The biggest problem with water snakes was the difficulty of identification. In the murky water common to Vietnamese environments, distinguishing between a poisonous snake and a harmless one was impossible until it was too late. Soldiers crossing rivers often felt something grazing on their submerged legs, generating instant panic even when the culprit was just vegetation or floating debris. But sometimes it was actually a snake, and stings often occurred during water crossings, with victims having to complete the crossing even while experiencing the effects of the poison. Aquatic leeches were even more problematic than their terrestrial cousins. Bigger and more aggressive, they could reach up to 20 centimeters in length when fully extended. These leeches detected disturbances in the water and actively swam toward potential hosts. During operations in flooded areas or river patrols, soldiers emerged from the water literally covered in leeches, with dozens or even hundreds of them attached to all exposed parts and many more who had found their way under clothing. The removal of so many leeches was a time-consuming and disgusting process, and the continued bleeding of the wounds caused by the anticoagulants in their saliva meant that uniforms and equipment became soaked with blood, attracting even more parasites and predators. Fish from Vietnamese waters also presented specific dangers. Certain species of catfish had spines on their dorsal and pectoral fins covered with poisonous glands. When handled or stepped on, these spines would bristle and could puncture light footwear, injecting venom that caused excruciating pain, massive swelling, and occasionally systemic complications. Soldiers who fished to supplement their rations or who simply stepped into shallow water often found these catfish painfully. The pain of a venomous catfish sting could be so intense that victims fainted, and full recovery often took weeks. Vietnam's freshwater environments also harbored parasitic worms that could penetrate intact human skin. Schistosomiasis, caused by trematode parasites, was acquired simply by exposure to contaminated water. The parasite larvae penetrated the skin, entered the bloodstream, and eventually settled in veins around the intestines or bladder, where they matured and began to produce eggs. The disease caused a variety of symptoms including fever, abdominal pain, bloody diarrhea, and in chronic cases, severe damage to organs including the liver and bladder. The incubation period meant soldiers often developed symptoms only months after initial exposure, making diagnosis challenging. Water itself, even in the absence of dangerous animal life, was problematic. Still waters and paddy fields and swamps often contained dangerous bacteria, including those that caused leptospirosis, a disease transmitted through the urine of rodents and other mammals. Infection occurred when contaminated water came into contact with cuts, abrasions, or mucous membranes. Leptospirosis caused flu-like symptoms that could progress to jaundice, kidney failure, internal bleeding, and meningitis. Without treatment, the mortality rate was significant. Soldiers with permanently damp feet developed a condition known as trench foot or immersion foot, where prolonged exposure to moisture caused tissue destruction, fungal and bacterial infections, and in severe cases, gangrene requiring amputation. But it wasn't just the big, obvious creatures that posed threats. Some of the most dangerous life forms in the Vietnamese jungle were invisible to the naked eye. The fungi and bacteria that thrived in the hot, humid environment turned even the most superficial scratches into serious infections. Any injury, no matter how small, exposed subcutaneous tissue to a microscopic army of pathogens. In the jungle, where equipment and uniforms never dried completely, where proper hygiene was impossible, and where medical treatment could be hours or days away, even minor cuts could become life-threatening. Bacterial infections progressed rapidly in heat and humidity, turning into abscesses, cellulitis, or in severe cases, systemic sepsis. Dermatophyte fungi caused persistent and painful skin infections. The so-called athlete's foot spread uncontrollably, causing deep, bleeding cracks between the toes. Yeast infections in the groin, known colloquially as athlete itching, made each movement a painful experience. These conditions not only caused physical discomfort but also undermined morale and the ability to concentrate. Soldiers dealt with intense and constant itching, rashes that spread regardless of treatment, and the feeling that their own bodies were decomposing around them. The jungle also housed ticks that transmitted rickettsia, bacteria that caused debilitating disease. Borreliosis, although best known in other regions of the world, also occurred in Vietnam, caused by tick-borne spirochetes. The initial symptoms often went unnoticed amidst the thousand other discomforts of jungle life, but the disease could progress to joint, cardiac, and neurological complications if left untreated. Now we need to discuss how all of these biological dangers interacted with the nature of war itself. The soldiers were not simply touring in a hostile environment where they could take careful precautions. They were engaged in combat operations that often required them to ignore natural hazards in favor of tactical objectives. A patrol could not stop to carefully check each branch for snakes or wait until all the leeches were removed before continuing a mission. Ambush happened at unpredictable times, forcing soldiers to throw themselves on the forest floor or into stagnant waters, regardless of what might be inhabiting these spaces. During intense firefights, when adrenaline surged and survival instinct took over, soldiers blindly ran through dense vegetation, grabbed branches and logs for support, and hid under foliage without considering what else might be sharing these spaces. There were countless cases of soldiers being bitten by snakes or bitten by scorpions in the middle of fighting, and only noticing hours later when the situation calmed down and the pain finally penetrated the post-adrenaline torpor. Some men discovered leeches feeding on sensitive areas of their bodies only when they were finally able to remove their uniforms and equipment at the end of multi-day patrols. Survival strategies in the jungle were taught during training, but the reality outweighed any preparation. Soldiers learned to beat their boots before putting them on to dislodge scorpions and spiders, to check their equipment before use, to avoid getting their hands on places they could not see clearly. But in the chaos of war, these precautions were often forgotten or impossible to implement. A soldier under enemy fire did not have the luxury of methodically checking every move. The urgency of immediate survival outweighed considerations of long-term threats from poisons or diseases. The fear of jungle creatures was sometimes as intense as the fear of the human enemy. Veterans reported decades later that their nightmares were not just about combat, but about waking up covered in leeches, about feeling a snake moving inside their clothing, about waiting for medical evacuation after encounters with dangerous wildlife. This type of trauma had visceral quality that conventional combat did not. It was the violation of personal space, the feeling that even your own body was not safe, that something could invade your skin or bite you while you slept helplessly. The medical infrastructure, while impressive at the time, struggled to cope with the variety of poisonings, infections and parasitosis that constantly flowed from combat areas. Doctors and nurses became improvised experts in tropical medicine, learning to identify symptoms of diseases they had rarely or never seen during their training. Antivenoms were stockpiled whenever possible, but the variety of snake species meant that the correct antivenom was not always available. Treatments for parasitic diseases were administered almost prophylactically in some cases, given the difficulty of definitive diagnosis in the field. Medical evacuation was often complicated by the nature of injuries caused by encounters with wildlife. A soldier bitten by a venomous snake needed urgent evacuation, but if the bite occurred during operation in hostile territory, transporting it could put the entire unit at risk. Impossible decisions were made regularly. How much risk could the unit take to evacuate a man? If daytime movements were impossible due to enemy activity, How long could the victim survive waiting for the night? These considerations added layers of stress and blame on leaders who already operated under extreme pressure. The very nature of the guerrilla war fought in Vietnam meant that soldiers spent prolonged periods in the jungle without returning to relatively safe bases. Patrols could last for weeks, with men sleeping on the forest floor, eating rations, and gradually seeing their bodies deteriorate under constant assault from elements and parasites. Accumulated fatigue, combined with relative malnutrition, chronic dehydration, and psychological stress, made soldiers more vulnerable to disease and less able to effectively deal with threats when they encountered them. The issue of proper clothing and equipment was a constant source of frustration. Uniforms developed for temperate climates did not adapt well to the tropical jungle. Boots disintegrated under constant exposure to moisture and mud, leaving feet vulnerable. Heavy clothing needed to protect against prickly vegetation and insects made movement even more difficult in the oppressive heat. Gloves offered hand protection but reduced critical manual dexterity in weapon handling. Each piece of equipment represented a compromise between protection and functionality. Modern equipment such as draining jungle boots and quick-drying uniforms were eventually developed and distributed, but thousands of soldiers had already served before these improvements were widely available. And even with better equipment, the fundamental reality did not change. Humans are intrinsically vulnerable and unsuitable for prolonged survival in tropical jungle without significant technology and infrastructure support. The Vietnamese local populations, who had coexisted with these same creatures and environments for generations, possessed deep and practical knowledge on how to navigate the dangers of the jungle. They knew which plants to avoid, where snakes were likely to rest, how to treat bites and stings with traditional remedies, and how to move through the forest minimizing dangerous encounters. This generational knowledge represented significant tactical advantage. Local soldiers could operate effectively on terrain that paralyzed unfamiliar adversaries, using the jungle itself as a weapon. There have been documented cases where local forces used traps that incorporated natural elements of the environment. Traps were sometimes positioned near wasp nests or areas known to harbor venomous snakes. Trails were sometimes directed to areas where encounters with wildlife were more likely. This represented pragmatic use of terrain knowledge by forces that were at a disadvantage in terms of technology and conventional firepower. The psychological impact of operating in such a hostile environment cannot be underestimated. Soldiers developed a constant state of hypervigilance, not only from human threats but from natural dangers that could appear at any time from any direction. This chronic stress contributed to mental exhaustion, deteriorating judgment, and in some cases, complete psychological breakdowns. The term combat stress was insufficient to describe what these men experienced. It was more like incessant sensory and emotional assault from multiple simultaneous sources. Interestingly, some soldiers developed an almost perverse fascination with the creatures that tormented them. There have been cases of men capturing snakes or spiders, keeping them as makeshift unit mascots, or even studying them in an attempt to understand and therefore control the fears these creatures inspired. This may have been a form of coping mechanism, transforming objects of terror into objects of scientific curiosity. Others have developed a deep and enduring hatred for all life forms in the jungle, associating each insect, reptile, or mammal with traumatic memories. The experience of being in the Vietnamese jungle has also created a paradoxical sense of wonder at the resilience and adaptability of nature. Even while suffering under assault from parasites, poisons, and predators, many soldiers could not help but recognize the brutal beauty of the ecosystem around them. The jungle was a perfectly adjusted survival machine, where each organism had evolved over millions of years to occupy its specific niche. Humans, for all their technology and intelligence, were clumsy and ill-equipped visitors to this world. Official statistics on casualties caused directly by wildlife versus combat are difficult to determine accurately. Many encounters with dangerous animals resulted in injuries that later became infected or in diseases that manifested long after the initial exposure, complicating causal attribution. The reality is that probably tens of thousands of soldiers suffered significant injuries or diseases caused directly or indirectly by encounters with Vietnamese wildlife. The legacy of these encounters persists decades after the end of the war. Veterans still deal with the consequences of parasitic diseases contracted in the jungle, with tissue damage from poisonings, with phobias developed in response to repeated traumas. Some have never felt comfortable in natural environments, associating any forest or wilderness with hidden dangers and imminent threats. Others became passionate advocates of conservation, recognizing that the creatures that so terrified them were simply animals acting out of their natures, defending their territories or seeking food on lands that always belonged to them. As we reflect on this often overlooked dimension of the Vietnam War, we are forced to confront uncomfortable truths about human limitations and the arrogance of assuming that technology and weaponry are sufficient to ensure dominance over any environment. The Vietnamese jungle demonstrated, repeatedly and unambiguously, that there were forces older and in some ways more formidable than modern armies. Snakes did not negotiate, mosquitoes did not recognize ceasefires, and malaria did not discriminate by political affiliation or nationality. This story serves as a reminder that when humans choose to wage war, the consequences extend far beyond direct combat casualties. Entire ecosystems are disturbed, animal populations are displaced or decimated, and those who survive the war bear scars not only of bullets and explosives but of 1,000 smaller encounters with creatures who simply tried to survive in a world invaded by conflict they did not understand and were not part of. The Vietnamese jungle continues to exist today, still harboring its venomous snakes, its giant spiders, its invisible predators, and its microscopic diseases. The trees that witnessed those terrible years still grow, perhaps some still carrying metal fragments on their trunks. Rivers still run, mosquitoes still buzz, and life continues its eternal cycle of predation and survival. The difference is that now, in the absence of human war, the jungle has returned to the natural balance that existed for eons before the arrival of armed conflict. For those young soldiers who entered that jungle decades ago, many of whom never returned, the dangers they faced shaped not just their individual experiences but the collective understanding that nature is not a passive setting for human dramas, but an active participant with their own agenda of survival and perpetuation. May we remember not only the human sacrifices of that conflict, but also the profound lesson on humility in the face of natural forces that know no ideology, only instinct and necessity. As we end this journey through the hidden dangers of the Vietnamese jungle, it is appropriate to recognize that all life, whether human or animal, whether recognized as noble or feared as monstrous, shares this earth that has been granted to us. Amid the horrors of war and terrifying encounters with venomous creatures and fierce predators, there was constant reminder of the complexity and interconnectedness of all existence. May the Lord God, in His infinite wisdom, grant us the ability to learn from these experiences, to seek peace rather than conflict, and to respect all forms of life that share this world with us, however uncomfortable or dangerous that sharing may sometimes seem.